And now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring my co-host here, Sanjeev Joshipura. Sanjeev is the Executive Director of Indiaspora, and he'll be your host for much of this morning and afternoon. Welcome, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Emar. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. What a great note to start this event on. Such an important conversation. We heard from Andrew, and then Emar had a question. So a great start to the event, to our Western Hemisphere Climate Summit. I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., and I'll be your MC for the rest of this event. We move on now to a moderated fireside chat on climate policy. And I'd like to introduce the facilitator of the chat, Clare Shakya, who is the Global Managing Director at the Nature Conservancy. She's joining us from Oxford in the UK. And I'm delighted to welcome you, Clare, because the UK, a couple of reasons. The UK is an important country for Indiaspora. We have a strong network of leaders there that we connect with on a regular basis. But also, we've actually worked with Oxford on a couple of different occasions, held a couple of different events with them. And so I'm just delighted to welcome someone that lives in that part of the world. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And really excited to be here as well. Realize that we're spanning a few time zones, so it's quite early for some people, but appreciate for all of those that have made it. And I'd like to invite my two fellow panelists to introduce themselves. First of all, Rwitwika, who is the CEO of Swaniti. Rwitwika, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to everyone for joining in. Really appreciate it, and good to see you, Aparna. I'm Rwitwika, and I'm the CEO for Swaniti Global Initiative. We are an ecosystem enabler, working towards a sustainable future in a climate-constrained world. That's a bunch of big and fancy words to say that we are working both at a community level as well as with private sector to unlock essentially government funding in South Asia and East Asia. We also have some work in the US. And our theory of change essentially focuses on saying that if we're able to leverage the strengths of the government by resources and private sector and civil society by the models that they replicate on energy transition, then we can work in an all hands on deck approach to fast track energy transition. So that's kind of a bit of the work that we do. And my role as CEO is to make sure that we have the strategic partnerships and the right people within the team to execute on these programs where we work on mission mode on a timeline to deliver.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in this fireside chat with you. So also, if Aparna, if you could also give a few minutes introduction to you and your current role, your experience.
Yeah, thanks. So hi, everybody. I'm Aparna Shrivastav. So I work as the Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, also known as the DFC. So we are basically the U.S. government's development bank, and we're mandated to partner with the private sector to address the most pressing challenges facing the world. And climate is a huge, huge area of priority. As Andrew was just mentioning, the U.S. government has really been employing a whole of government approach to addressing the climate crisis, and DFC is very much the tip of the spear when it comes to international climate finance. So I joined DFC just about 3 years ago, towards the start of the administration. There was no climate office before I joined, and so I've worn a number of hats since joining, but really ultimately it's all been with the aim of increasing DFC's climate finance, thinking through strategies, partnerships, kind of how we're managing our investment pipeline, how we're thinking about growth, whether that's kind of in specifically just dollars or looking at kind of various subsectors or regions. So happy to talk more about that in this conversation. But in terms of my background, I studied mechanical and environmental engineering many years ago, and then ended up in I was very, very interested in international development, and so found myself specifically working across a number of different NGOs in India, in Uganda, Kenya, and a few other countries, starting out primarily in water and sanitation, but then moving into public health, agriculture, and a few other areas. And ultimately, it was pretty impossible to be working in international development without recognizing the massive elephant, not even in the room, but that just was the entire room. That was climate. That was really kind of hitting on all sorts of sectors and impacts that we were trying to have when it came to sustainable development. And so that's kind of what nudged me to move kind of entirely into the climate space and climate finance specifically. So yeah, very, very pleased to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And from that background, you can I can sense that we've got sort of quite different experiences, really, in terms of the sort of locus of attention. So I guess if we just focus to start with on how you're seeing the challenges, we're at this particular point now where the climate impacts are very real and compounding. Climate finance is still hard to access, and there's an awful lot of the world where the large finance flows are still going towards the wrong things, towards more fossil fuel exploitation or use, and towards things that degrade nature. So whilst the big flows are in the billions, the effective flows that are going to support more effective action and get communities really able to set their vision is still not there. So maybe I could ask both of you just to reflect briefly on what the challenges are that we need to really tackle immediately. Rwitwika, do you want to start again, or?
Sure, absolutely, happy to. So I think, you know, the fascinating thing about where we are with, if I can frame it broadly as like the climate discussion, is, you know, we had our phase of awareness and kind of knowledge building of the fact that this was a real crisis coming up. It's transitioned to a lot of government policy, and a lot of governments now setting target and net zero targets, where I think as I see it every day, the fundamental problem now is becoming in how do you operationalize this? I don't think the fact that climate is an urgent issue and is the call of this generation or the crisis of this generation is anyone is going to question that. But what does a world where we're addressing these challenges effectively look like, I think, is the biggest bottleneck. What I mean by that is, let's just take the example of a lot of the communities where we work are coal mining communities. And so whether it's US or whether it's India or whether it's Indonesia, you know, we're trying to work with communities to understand what does a post-coal community look like? What are the job opportunities? What are the demographies going to look like? What will happen to the assets which exist in there? You know, what is going to essentially look like the future of the people who are living there? And honestly, I think we're still trying to grapple what that looks like. And so it's more now, it's becoming a reality by way of implementation. And where I think we all grapple with is we theoretically understand what are the things that need to be done. What we're, as Swaniti, our kind of big focus is to now say, okay, well, if we do these things, this is what tangibly a successful future for you looks like. And that's where I think a big daunting question comes in, because climate is also like a very cross-cutting issue. And there are so many different facets we're dealing with. We're dealing with finance, we're dealing with equity, we're dealing with, like, you know, land use. Like, there are just so many different floating pieces. And I think that, you know, in the opening piece, I've talked about all hands on deck to make it tangible, to make it something which you can really kind of wrap your head around, and something that needs to be wrapped around in terms of the next, you know, 15, 20 years. We need to make it that much more real. And I think, you know, if I can, Aparna, refer to your quote, that's not the elephant in the room, that is the room.
Thanks. And Aparna, how would you see the set of challenges we're facing?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest one, I guess wouldn't come as a surprise given that I'm aware, but truly I think is just looking at the financing gaps. So if you look at kind of the reports, even whether it's from the climate policy initiatives, global landscape on climate finance, or kind of the various resources that have come out in the last 6 months, what is promising is that there is a lot more financing flowing, which is a good thing, but it is nowhere nearly enough. I think we're looking at only having roughly 10 to 15% of kind of what anticipated investment needs are actually being projected to be filled if we follow the current trajectory. And that is something that we really need to get ahead of, because I think especially when you're thinking about The more that we do now to mitigate GHGs getting into the atmosphere, or kind of building up the resilience, it is that much less that kind of has to happen in the future. And so just making sure that we're being as proactive as possible is really, really quite critical. So I think it's great that there is more financing flows, but ultimately the other kind of nuance that we have to keep in mind is that there's not nearly enough private sector capital. So there is, like, with everybody combined, in terms of public budgets, there is no balance sheet large enough in the public sector that will be large enough to finance the clean energy transition, that will be able to finance kind of the community-based resilience needs that exist, and that will continue to grow as this crisis unfolds. And so really looking at how we can be crowding in more private sector capital into this space, I think is just really, really critical. And in some models, it's already happening, right? If you look at kind of how the cost curves of renewables has steadily been coming down and is now across the board a more cost competitive investment in the long run compared to kind of fossil infrastructure. While that is true, and while there is kind of financing flowing to those areas, when you look at it from kind of a full economy perspective, right, looking at all of the different sectors that are being impacted by this crisis, whether that is food security or water security or electric mobility or kind of clean energy manufacturing supply chains, right? It's really there's opportunities in nearly every sector of the economy, and nearly all of them could use more capital to actually be able to scale with the speed that they need to, and also in the communities, right? I think Rwitwika, I really appreciated just learning more about kind of how your organization has been working on this and kind of really centering kind of community interests, because I think while the financing flows are important to track kind of at a higher level, they have to also be flowing in a way that makes sense for the communities that they're impacting and looking to improve. I think currently, if you look at the stats, I think aggregate numbers, we're looking at least 90% of financing is either coming from public budgets and or going primarily to the global north. And so looking at how can we really equip the populations that are most vulnerable and kind of really on the front lines is just super, super essential. But I think it's important. It's not just a challenge, it's a tremendous opportunity.
Okay, well, that's a good moment to start looking at what do you see as the solutions? What should we be focusing on? And I don't know, do we go in the same order? Rwitwika, do you want to go first, or Aparna, do you want to jump in and get there first?
So that's good. I'll go ahead. I do think, so I'll just pick up where Aparna left off. I do think that finance is definitely going to be the immediate need for solutions. So there's definitely like I'd say a list. I wouldn't even put it as a hierarchy. There's a list of solutions that need to be responded to. So one is definitely the fact that what does financing of this look like? And I think there is, as much as there's a global conversation happening on this, there's also a need for countries to look inward in terms of what resources are. So I think one of the things, if you look at like India and Indonesia come in, because I've worked there most, but essentially if you look at a lot of the conversation, a lot of it is also dependent on what is coming in externally. I know in India, for example, there's a lot of government programs which do actually feed in really well into the climate discussion. And can actually fund a lot of the especially rural movement toward more agricultural friendly practices, more kind of seed funding for green economies. But so much of the financing discussion is about fund flows which will come in from the global north. And I think there needs to be kind of a reframing of what the possibilities are. The JETP is kind of nudging a lot of the countries to look, South Africa and Indonesia, to look inward and say, what are the possible funding sources from within the country? But I don't know if there's enough thinking or enough framing of that, which is necessarily nudging countries to think that way. With that being said, again, echoing Aparna's point, I do think finance is going to be the immediate pressing piece, which is there. In light of finance, I think, we might be missing some of the key points of what is so important and what really makes this movement stand out, which is the focus on equity. Unlike a lot of other movements, climate movement has at the center talked about just transition and the fact that equity is at the core of what this movement is. And so how do you tie in what the values and the ethos of this particular conversation has been with equity, with inclusiveness, and make sure that financing is tied to that, or I think the more nuanced challenges which are there. And so if you're looking at financing private sector, how do you bring that conversation in? And, as we're building out the solution, we need to be mindful of the fact that this has to be a more nuanced solution depending on the context as well as the stakeholder. And so even if we're talking about government policies going forward, to enable certain industries to decarbonize at a faster pace, what is going to be built in by way of equity? So I think the solution, definitely the orientation towards looking at how do you release more resources for a transition from not just from an external funding perspective or funding coming from the global north perspective, but also from what is possible in country. And then the second is maintaining the ethos of what needs to be there for equity and inclusion.
Great. And Aparna?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'll start by sharing one of the things that has been just really, really energizing and motivating for our office is actually being able to track some of the progress we've been able to grow, we've been able to make in terms of growing our portfolio for climate. So when we joined in 2021, DFC that year committed just about $400 million in climate-related investments globally. And this was certainly exciting, but we were really keen on ensuring that we could grow that as much as possible. And last year, we actually we committed over 3.7 billion in climate investments, and that is just over the last 3 years that we've been able to do that. And one of the big ways that we really did that, and I think I touched upon this a little bit earlier as well, was first of all recognizing that we really needed a whole of agency approach, and that meant helping the agency recognize across every single investment team that climate is a consideration to be made and an opportunity to consider when you're looking at kind of various potential investment risks or impacts, and just kind of opportunities for DFC to do more to build the resilience or kind of address kind of GHG emissions. And so that has been something that's been really exciting, is just kind of really taking a whole of agency, but what that also means is looking at every single sector and looking at truly every single investment that's coming through our pipeline from the lens of, okay, how can this be more climate aligned to push more? And so yeah, just figuring out how we can scale, how we can continue to scale is a big part of, I think, our day-to-day. But I think one thing for me personally that has been interesting to think about is, okay, it's good that we are having really encouraging results when it comes to the volume of our investments. But we're also now working on a strategy refresh for our climate investments that's specifically looking at how diversified our portfolio is, both by region, but also by sector. And looking at, okay, what are the underinvested sectors that need more capital to be able to kind of catalyze and get to the point that they can actually attract private capital themselves, whether that's kind of, for example, green hydrogen or battery storage on the energy side, in infrastructure, looking at water and sanitation, looking at nature-based solutions, and kind of across the board, really looking at, okay, it's great that we have kind of these larger numbers that we're working with in terms of our investment volumes, but how can we really make sure that our impact is as kind of diversified as possible and really kind of catalyzing more and more impact? I think I'll just add that the two areas that I think I personally am really eager to have DFC do more in, and I'm hoping to see more and more opportunity. One is in adaptation and resilience, and specifically looking at how to really anchor as much of our work in building community level resilience as possible. And the second is in nature-based solutions. DFC has actually been kind of forging a path alongside some key partners for some innovative transactions on for debt for nature swaps, as they're known. So there's a Belize blue bond, and also one that was issued in Galapagos that has been a really, really innovative and impactful transaction that has basically been able to refinance and restructure sovereign debt in countries, and basically the savings for that is then directed towards conservation activities that are run by local, kind of a locally established trust with local leaders in support. And so, yeah, there's a lot more work to be done, but I think there's actually some really interesting opportunities to dig in on.
It's a great example, and it nicely brings together actually the points you've both been making about the need to make this real in specific context, and look at what the interventions could be that actually meet community needs and create jobs and future wealth as well. One of the questions we've been asked in the chat, I realize that we're running out of time, so I'm just moving us on to questions, and I'll give you both an opportunity just to sort of finish with one sentence finishing at the end. But one of the questions we've been asked in the Q&A is around, with corporate profits soaring in the US, what do you feel the responsibilities and obligations of the corporations are to tackle climate change, not just in their own business operations, but in terms of equity between the financially rich global north and the developing global south? And that seemed to speak very strongly to both of your comments. So any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, I think everybody has a responsibility, no matter kind of what hat they're wearing, but especially when it comes to kind of entities that do have so many resources available to them, 100%. The one example that comes to mind that might be interesting to look into is the Justice 40 initiative that was launched at the beginning of the administration, that's specifically targeting, it's more domestically oriented, but really looking at how to ensure that financial flows are actually reaching historically marginalized communities within the US.
And just really quickly, thank you for that question. I think that's a very fair question. And, you know, I think one of the things that the framework right now does not necessarily extend itself for companies in the global north to necessarily do as much. And what I mean by that is, again, I'll take the example of Indonesia. One of the things that they're looking at is, can we look at decarbonizing large industries in this country, in Indonesia, and within that, can some of the big players, especially like the Adidas and the Nike, be the first to decarbonize and set the example? One framework which is interesting and worth looking into is, instead of just focus on the countries which are headquartered in the global north, can we look at the supply chain of MSMEs that they're linked to also decarbonize them? And so this is something which in that country context has just been really interesting, and how the government is trying to frame that discussion and look at supply chains and link that to companies in the global north. But I think that's just one framework of what the possibilities are by way of responsibilities and how they can act on that. So I do think the potential for that is a lot. At this point, I do think both industry association, industries, and policymakers need to start to look at what the plethora of solutions can exist to actually have them respond more accountably.
Okay, so I'm running out of time very fast, and I want to give you both.
Claire, if you don't mind, sorry, this is Sanjeev again. Just one quick question, if I might interject very quickly.
Sure.
This is from one of our Indiaspora members in Houston, Texas, Dhiren Shetia, and he asked the question. It's in the chat box, but I'll read it out loud for everyone's benefit. Great panel, thanks. It is quite clear now that both the private and the public sectors, due to political uncertainty globally, are wavering to meet the financial requirements for energy transition. Can you share your thoughts in prioritization of the transition, that is technologies, regions, etc., in light of this practical reality? Thanks. Just earlier today, Claire, just for context, I was speaking with someone from another climate organization, and we were talking about England, as a matter of fact, and how both political parties in England are, you know, debating and sort of scaling back a little bit on their climate pledges. So that's just one case in point among many, but go ahead.
Yeah, Sanjeev, a very difficult issue indeed when countries start to roll back, including as we're seeing in the UK. So Rwitwika, Aparna, any thoughts on actually how do we prioritize when finance is insufficient? And I guess this really speaks to that issue of justice that came up in the earlier question as well. Is there a way we can think about this so that we are the problem with the energy transition is we need to do all of it all at once and very fast.
Yeah, precisely. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Go, Aparna. Yeah.
Just a few quick thoughts. I mean, I think when it comes to the mitigation side, I think it's a little bit easier to look at how to think of a prioritization framework, specifically looking at kind of what has the most potential in terms of lowering, basically the cost of dollar per ton removal of CO2 from looking at different technologies. And that kind of varies from one sector to the other, from one region to the other. But obviously anything in renewables, we're actually in the midst of a really robust analysis specifically of how we can look at kind of prioritization across these spaces. And I think one of the biggest areas that we've seen of opportunity in Asia, for example, is just really focusing in on diversifying clean energy supply chain, and specifically manufacturing of various components. And so I think in that region, for example, on the mitigation side, that's a huge area. There's also tremendous need, for example, for baseload technology, whether that's green hydrogen or basically non-carbon intensive baseload that can really kind of ensure that grids are able to transition. One of the examples that you'll see is in Kenya. Kenya's grid is over 90% renewables, and that is thanks to their well-developed geothermal resource in the Great Rift Valley. And so on the mitigation side, I think there's some clear ways of analysis. On the adaptation side of the coin, I think there's kind of important considerations around which countries are most vulnerable and kind of least able to adapt given their own kind of constraints. And I think we're still kind of getting to the bottom of that analysis. But Claire, I know that you have worked on this for years. So I'd also invite if you wanted to share some thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some obvious countries that just by the fact that they don't have very much budget themselves are really struggling and they're small markets, so they struggle to attract the private finance. So small island developing states, least developed countries all seem to struggle more to bring in the private investment that's needed. So definitely needs a bit more support from the public investors or from the development financial institutions. Rwitwika, I'm going to give you the opportunity to give the final word from a bottom-up perspective, given we've really run over time now.
Oh, no pressure there. No, but thank you so much. And Darren, shout out to you because I'm also based out of Houston, so I'm going to try and close this with a comment up from your side. I think the biggest issue I'd say is the narrative that we're following, and this is my 30-second pitch. I think the narrative is still so much around urgency as opposed to opportunity, and I think Clare, you opened with this. If we can reframe the narrative to talk about the fact that I think I'd heard a while back the climate movement being described as being at the precipice of the new industrial revolution. And I thought that was a great framing. And if we frame this as an urgent need to be at the precipice of the new industrial revolution, I think we have the opportunity to grow that much more. As opposed to playing catch up, we're actually leading the way. And if we reframe the narrative, the politics of it actually follows in through the narrative. So I do think there's a need to reframe where we are with the climate narrative. That's my closing comment, and I know we're 3 minutes over, so I'll go ahead and
that's a great way to close us off. Thank you so much, and thank you both for joining, and to Indiaspora for having this panel. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clare, Rwitwika, and Aparna. My favorite part about organizing Indiaspora events is that I get to attend them and listen to people like you engage in such substantive conversations. So really do appreciate your panel.